Three riders appeared on the ridge, their horses kicking up dust as they made their way down toward Daniel Cooper's cabin. At 28, the young rancher looked more like a fresh-faced farmer than the man who'd once tracked the West's most dangerous criminals through unforgiving wilderness. His quiet demeanor and gentle way with horses had earned him respect among his neighbors who knew nothing of the deadly skills he'd left behind 5 years ago. The morning dew still clung to the grass as Daniel worked the fence line, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd found peace in honest labor. The small ranch wasn't much, just 40 acres, a modest cabin, and a well-maintained stable, but it was his, bought with reward money he'd rather forget earning. The sound of his tools and the occasional lowing of cattle had replaced the thunder of gunfire and the desperate chase of outlaws that had once defined his life. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine from the surrounding hills, rustling through the tall grass that swayed like waves across his pasture. Daniel had chosen this spot carefully when he decided to leave his old life behind. Nestled in a valley with clear sightlines in all directions, multiple escape routes through the hills, and enough distance from town to avoid unwanted attention. Old habits died hard, even when you were trying to bury them. Sarah Miller, the local schoolteacher, had stopped by earlier with fresh bread and news from town. Her visits had become more frequent lately, and Daniel found himself looking forward to them, even as he worried that his past might someday put her in danger. She'd been telling him about plans for the harvest festival, her green eyes bright with excitement as she described the decorations and dance preparations. Something in her smile made him wish he could be the simple rancher she thought he was. "You should join the planning committee," she'd suggested, brushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. "The children would love to have you teach them about caring for animals. You have such a way with them." Daniel had demurred, as he always did when it came to becoming too involved in town affairs. "Got too much work here," he'd said, though they both knew it wasn't the whole truth. It was during their conversation that he'd first noticed the dust on the horizon, and something in his expression had made Sarah look at him with concern before she left. Now, as the riders approached, Daniel's hands continued their work, while his mind automatically catalogued details he'd rather forget. The lead rider had a distinctive scar running from his left eye to his jaw, the kind that came from a knife fight, deliberate, slow, meant to hurt. His coat was trail-worn but well-maintained, and the way he carried himself spoke of someone used to giving orders and having them obeyed. The second man was younger, maybe 25, with a flashy gun belt that sat too low on his hip, the kind who was quick to draw but probably couldn't hit the broad side of a barn in a real firefight. The third hung back, quiet and watchful, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. This was the dangerous one, the kind Daniel used to worry about most during his hunting days. "Hey there, young fella," called the scarred man, who introduced himself as Jake Hawley. "Heard you might be willing to board some horses for a few days. We're just passing through." The way he said it made it clear they were anything but simple. Travelers. Daniel recognized the name. Jake Hawley had a price on his head in 3 territories, wanted for robbery and murder. 5 years ago, Daniel would have already been planning how to bring him in, dead or alive. He'd have noted the slight favor Hawley showed his left leg, the way his gun hand twitched when he spoke, details that could mean the difference between life and death in a pursuit. Daniel wiped his hands on his work pants, keeping his movements deliberately slow and unthreatening. "Got a full stable right now," he replied, his voice carrying the easy drawl of a simple rancher. "Miller's place down the valley might have room." His eyes flickered briefly to his cabin, where his old tracking gear and specially modified Winchester rifle lay hidden beneath floorboards he'd hoped never to lift again. The rifle had been custom-made for him by a gunsmith in Denver, with unique modifications that had helped build the legend of the Shadow Rider, a legend he'd tried hard to leave behind. The second rider, who introduced himself as Chet Morris with a sneer, spat a stream of tobacco juice in the dust. "Ain't asking, boy. We're staying." His hand rested too close to his gun, fingers drumming against the worn leather in a way that betrayed his nervousness. Daniel felt an old, familiar tension creep into his muscles, the same tension that had once kept him alive while tracking men like these through some of the deadliest territory in the West. The quiet third rider, whose name wasn't offered, studied Daniel with unnervingly intelligent eyes. Something in his gaze suggested recognition, and Daniel felt his stomach tighten. He'd been careful these past 5 years, but rumors had a way of surviving, like rattlesnakes in winter. The man's posture was relaxed, but Daniel noticed how he kept his right side angled slightly away, giving him quicker access to his weapon while appearing casual, a professional's trick. "Your ranch has got a good view of the valley," Hawley observed, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Perfect spot. To watch the roads." He smiled, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Mind if we take a look around?" His horse, a well-muscled bay, shifted restlessly, sensing the tension in the air. Young Tommy Parker, Daniel's 12-year-old neighbor who sometimes helped with the horses, chose that moment to ride up on his pony. The boy's face was bright, with excitement, oblivious to the tension in the air. His red and white Pinto kicked up small clouds of dust as it trotted into the yard. "Mr. Cooper, Ma wanted to know if you're coming to Sunday dinner," and he trailed off, finally noticing the strangers. Tommy had been coming by regularly since his father had passed last winter, looking for both work and guidance. Daniel had found himself becoming unexpectedly attached to the boy, teaching him about horses and ranch work, sharing the simple skills that had nothing to do with his darker past. "Tommy!" Daniel called out, his voice steady but carrying an authority the boy had never heard before. "Ride on home now. Tell your ma I'll let her know about dinner later." Something in Daniel's tone made Tommy nod quickly and turn his pony around, though he cast curious glances over his shoulder as he rode away. Daniel watched until the boy was safely out of sight, remembering another young life cut short in Thunder Valley 5 years ago. "Seems you're good with kids," Hawley commented, watching Tommy disappear down the trail. "Regular upstanding citizen, ain't you?" There was mockery in his voice, but also something else. Calculation. The quiet rider whispered something to him, and Hawley's expression changed subtly, like a cloud passing over the sun. "You know," Hawley said slowly, shifting in his saddle, "you remind me of someone. Few years back there was this bounty hunter, called him the Shadow Rider. Never saw his face proper, but he moved just like you. Tracked men through territory that would kill most folks. Had this trick with a Winchester rifle." He paused, watching Daniel carefully. "Killed my brother up in Thunder Valley." Daniel kept his face neutral, though his right hand twitched slightly, a tell he'd spent years trying to eliminate. "Lots of bounty hunters out there," he replied evenly. "Never much cared for that type myself. Prefer honest work with honest people." The words tasted bitter in his mouth, reminding him of all the lies he'd had to tell to build his new life. Hawley nodded, but his eyes had grown cold as mountain ice. "We'll take those stables," he said, no longer pretending to ask. "And we might be having a longer conversation later about honest work." The threat in his voice was clear as a rattler's warning. His hand rested casually on his saddle horn, but Daniel noticed how his fingers stayed close to his holster. As the 3 riders moved toward the stable, Daniel remained by the fence, his posture relaxed, but his mind racing. They'd be back, if not for revenge, then because they were planning something. The valley had only one good road to the territorial bank in Millbrook, and next week was payroll for the silver mines. He'd heard whispers in town about the size of the shipment, though he'd pretended not to pay attention to such things anymore. Before we continue with Daniel's struggle between his peaceful present and violent past, tell us where you're watching. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we've saved something special just for you. The valley was his home now, and good people like Sarah and Tommy's family depended on its peace. As Daniel watched the riders stable their horses, he wondered if a man could ever truly escape what he was born to be, or if some skills, once learned, demanded to be used, not for vengeance or reputation, but for protection of something worth more than both. The weight of his hidden Winchester seemed to call to him from beneath the cabin's floorboards, like an old friend waiting to remind him of who he really was. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Pine Creek Valley as Daniel made his way back to the cabin, his mind heavy with the weight of the morning's encounter. Inside, he moved straight to the loose floorboard beneath his bed, fingers tracing the familiar grooves until he found the hidden latch. He hadn't opened it in 5 years, but the mechanism slid smoothly, well-oiled despite its disuse. The Winchester lay wrapped in oiled cloth, alongside a leather folder filled with wanted posters and tracking maps. His fingers lingered on the rifle's custom modifications, the specialized sight, the adjusted trigger pull, the modified loading mechanism that had helped build his reputation. The Shadow Rider had been known for making impossible shots, tracking outlaws through territory others wouldn't dare enter. Now those same skills might be needed to protect everything he'd built here. A knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. "Mr. Cooper," Sarah Miller's voice carried through the wood. "Are you there?" Daniel quickly replaced the floorboard before opening the door. Sarah stood on his porch, concern evident in her green eyes. The late afternoon light caught the auburn highlights in her hair, reminding him of autumn leaves. "I saw those men riding in," she said, stepping inside. "Tommy Parker told his mother they seemed dangerous. The whole town's talking about them." She paused, studying his face. "Are you all right?" "Just some travelers looking to board their horses," Daniel replied, the lie sitting uncomfortably in his throat. "Nothing to worry about." Sarah moved to his small kitchen table, setting down a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "I brought extra bread," she said, but her eyes told him she hadn't come just for that. "Daniel, I've known you for 3 years now. You're not telling me everything." The sound of horses outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see Chet Morris and the quiet rider leading their mounts to the water trough. Hawley was notably absent. "They're planning something," Sarah said softly, watching the men. "Sheriff Matthews should be notified." Daniel shook his head. "Sheriff's away at the territorial capital until next week. Deputy Wells is too green to handle men like these." He didn't add that he recognized the quiet rider now. Sam Ghost Walker, known for his ability to slip in and out of towns unnoticed during robberies. "How do you know these things?" Sarah asked, turning to face him. "Sometimes you say things, notice things. You're different from other ranchers, Daniel." He moved to the stove, buying time by putting on coffee. "Spent some time traveling before. Settling here, you pick things up." Another half-truth to add to the pile. "Like how you taught Tommy to track lost cattle," she pressed. "Or how you always seem to know when storms are coming by reading signs most people miss. Or maybe like how you knew exactly what to do when the Morgan twins got lost in the hills last winter." Daniel's hand tightened on the coffee pot. The twins' rescue had been too close to his old ways, tracking them through difficult terrain, reading signs others had missed. He'd found them just before a blizzard hit, but the skills he'd displayed had raised questions. "Sarah," he started, but she cut him off. "I'm not asking you to tell me everything," she said, moving closer. "But I know there's more to you than just a rancher. The way you carry yourself, the way you observe everything. You're like no one else in this valley." Outside, Ghostwalker was studying the ranch's layout with too much interest, his eyes lingering on approach routes and sight lines. Daniel had done the same thing himself, hundreds of times, when planning to bring in a target. "Maybe there are things better left unknown," Daniel said quietly. "Safer that way." Sarah's hand touched his arm gently. Safer for whom? You've helped so many people here. Whatever you're hiding, whatever you're running from, this is your home now. You have friends here, people who care about you. The weight of her words hung in the air, interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Through the window, they saw Tommy Parker riding hard toward the cabin, his pony kicking up dust. "Mr. Cooper!" the boy called out, barely waiting for his mount to stop before jumping down. "Riders coming up from South Fork, 4 of them moving fast." Daniel's mind raced. South Fork meant they were coming up the old mining road, the same route the payroll wagon would take next week. He moved to the door, catching Tommy before the boy could rush in. "How far out?" he asked, his voice carrying the sharp authority that occasionally slipped through his rancher's facade. "Maybe 20 minutes, Tommy replied, excited rather than scared. "Saw them from Eagle Point while I was checking for strays. They're riding hard, Mr. Cooper, and they're armed." Sarah watched the exchange, noting how Daniel's posture had changed, more alert, more dangerous somehow. "Tommy, ride home now," she said firmly. "Stay there until someone comes for you." "But Miss Miller," Tommy protested, "I want to help. Mr. Cooper's been teaching me about tracking and—" "Now, Tommy," Daniel cut in, his tone brooking no argument. The boy reluctantly mounted his pony, casting longing looks over his shoulder as he rode away. "More of Hawley's men?" Sarah asked once Tommy was gone. Daniel nodded grimly. "Likely. 4 riders plus the 3 already here. They're planning something big." He turned to Sarah, his expression serious. "You need to leave. Whatever's coming. I don't want you caught in it." "And what about you?" she demanded. "You're just 1 man against 7. A ghost of a smile crossed Daniel's face. "Wouldn't be the worst odds I've faced." The words slipped out before he could catch them. Sarah's eyes widened slightly, but before she could respond, Ghostwalker appeared at the cabin's door. "Cooper!" he called out, his voice surprisingly soft for such a dangerous man. "Boss wants a word." Daniel exchanged a look with Sarah. "Miss Miller was just leaving," he said pointedly. "Actually," Ghostwalker said, "Boss wants to talk to her. Too. Says it's about making sure everyone understands each other." Daniel's right hand twitched, the old tell returning as adrenaline coursed through his system. 5 years ago, he would have already had 3 ways to handle this situation, all of them violent. Now, with Sarah involved, his options were limited. "It's all right," Sarah said, though her voice trembled slightly. "We'll hear what they have to say." As they walked toward the stable, Daniel's mind catalogued everything within reach that could serve as a weapon. The spare length of rope by the door, the pitchfork leaning against the wall, the distance to his cabin where the Winchester waited, old habits surfacing again, whether he wanted them to or not. Before we continue with this confrontation, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we've saved something special just for you. Hawley stood in the stable doorway, his scarred face twisted in a knowing smile. The sound of approaching horses could be heard in the distance, his reinforcements getting closer. The afternoon sun cast his shadow long across the yard, stretching toward Daniel and Sarah like a reaching hand. "Time we had us a proper talk," Hawley said, his voice carrying the edge of a blade, "about banking business, peaceful valleys, and old ghosts that just won't stay buried." Jake Hawley's men arrived just as the sun reached its peak, their horses lathered from hard riding. Daniel counted them from the stable doorway. 4 riders, as Tommy had reported, each one carrying the hard look of men who killed for pay rather than passion. Combined with Hawley, Ghostwalker, and Chet Morris, they made seven killers who now stood between him and the peaceful life he'd built. "Quite a cozy setup you got here, Cooper," Hawley said, gesturing around the stable, where Sarah sat rigidly on a hay bale, Ghostwalker standing near her with his deceptively relaxed pose. "Nice quiet valley, good views of the road, perfect spot to mind your own business." The threat in his voice was clear as mountain water. "That's all I want to do," Daniel replied evenly, though his mind was racing through scenarios, calculating angles and distances just as he had in his hunting days. "Mind my own business." One of the new arrivals, a tall man with a face like weathered leather, stepped forward. "This him, Jake?" "Don't look like much." The man's voice carried a Texas drawl, and Daniel recognized him. Bill Corvin, wanted in 3 states for stage robbery and murder. "Don't matter what he looks like, Bill," Hawley replied, his eyes never leaving Daniel. "What matters is who he is, or rather, who he used to be." He pulled out a worn piece of paper from his coat, a wanted poster, yellowed with age. Daniel's heart tightened as he recognized it. Sarah leaned forward, straining to see, but Ghost Walker shifted slightly, blocking her view. Daniel silently thanked the outlaw's intervention. He wasn't ready for her to learn the truth, not like this. "Interesting reading," Hawley continued, waving the poster. "The Shadow Rider, they called him, never caught more than glimpses, knew every trail, every hiding spot in 5 territories, had this special rifle custom-made, could hit a man at distances that seemed impossible." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Killed my baby brother up in Thunder Valley." "I told you," Daniel said carefully. "Lot of bounty hunters out there." Hawley's scarred face twisted in a cruel smile. "That's true, but only one who disappeared right after Thunder Valley. Only one who moved like you move, watched like you watch. Only one who'd pick a spread with sightlines like this and escape routes through those hills. The other newcomers spread out around the stable, blocking the exits." Daniel noted their positions automatically, old instincts rising to the surface. Like a shark scenting blood. The nearest man, barely more than a boy, held his rifle too loosely. The one by the door favored his right leg, probably from an old injury. Details that could mean the difference between life and death if things went bad. "So here's how this plays out," Hawley continued. "Bank payrolls coming through next week. Nearly 50,000 in silver and currency. You're going to help us take it." "I'm a rancher," Daniel protested, but the words sounded hollow even to his ears. "No," Hawley said softly, dangerously. "You're the man who tracked criminals through territory that would kill most folks. The man who could read signs others couldn't even see. The man who brought in Mason Carter and the Denton brothers. The man who killed my brother." His voice hardened. "And now you're going to use those skills for us." Sarah's gasp was barely audible, but it cut Daniel like a knife. He couldn't look at her, couldn't bear to see the realization in her eyes. "And if I refuse?" Daniel asked. Though he already knew the answer, Hawley's smile widened. "Well, then we start making examples. Maybe start with the schoolhouse. Lot of nice folks in this valley. Be a shame if anything happened to them, especially the children." His eyes flicked to Sarah. "Or maybe we start closer to home." The threat ignited something in Daniel's chest, a cold fury he hadn't felt since Thunder Valley. His right hand twitched, and he saw Ghost Walker tense slightly, recognizing the tell of a dangerous man. "You're making a mistake," Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made several of the men shift uncomfortably. "Only mistake," Hawley replied, "was thinking you could bury who you really are. Men like us, Cooper, or whatever your real name is, we don't change. We just wear different masks for a while." One of the new arrivals, the young one with the loose grip on, his rifle laughed nervously. 7 of us against 1 rancher. Don't matter who he used to be." "Quiet, Billy," Ghost Walker spoke for the first time, his soft voice carrying across the stable. The younger man subsided, but not before Daniel had logged another weakness to exploit if needed. "Here's what's going to happen," Hawley continued. "You're going to ride with us tomorrow, show us all those secret trails you know so well. Help us set up the perfect spot to take that payroll. Do that, maybe we let your lady friend here live. Maybe we leave your precious valley in one piece." Sarah stood suddenly, shrugging off Ghost Walker's restraining hand. "Daniel would never help you." Her voice shook with either fear or anger. Daniel couldn't tell which. "He's not what you think he is. He's a good man." "Good man?" Hawley laughed, the sound echoing off the stable walls. "Lady, there ain't no such thing as a good man who's good at killing. And your friend here, he was the best." "You're wrong," Sarah insisted, but Daniel could hear the doubt creeping into her voice. "Tell her, Cooper," Hawley pressed. "Tell her. About Thunder Valley. Tell her about all the men you hunted down. Tell her about my brother, lying in the dirt with half his head gone from one of your impossible shots. Before we continue with Daniel's response, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we've saved something special just for you." The afternoon sun slanted through the stable windows, catching dust motes in its beams. Outside, a horse whinnied nervously, sensing the tension in the air. Daniel stood perfectly still, feeling the weight of his past pressing down on him like a physical thing. In his mind, he could feel the familiar shape of his Winchester, hidden beneath the cabin's floorboards. The same rifle that had helped build his legend, and the same one that had ended a young man's life in Thunder Valley. "You have until sunrise," Hawley said finally, breaking the heavy silence. "Decide by then. Help us take the payroll, or we start burning down everything you've built here." He gestured to his men. "Watch him. He tries anything. Shoot him in the leg. We need him mobile, not comfortable." As Hawley turned to leave, he paused at the door. "Oh, and Cooper? Don't get any ideas about warnings or signals. Mrs. Miller here will be staying with us until this is done. Consider her our insurance policy." Daniel's mask slipped for just a moment, and several of the men took involuntary steps back at what they saw in his eyes. Only Ghostwalker stood his ground, watching with what might have been understanding. "Sunrise," Hawley repeated, and then he was gone, leaving Daniel with his choices and the weight of a past he could no longer outrun. Twilight crept over Pine Creek Valley like a slowly drawn curtain as Daniel sat in his cabin, watched by two of Hawley's men through the windows. They'd let him return to the house, but kept Sarah in the stable under Ghostwalker's guard. Daniel's mind raced through possibilities, each one darker than the last. His eyes kept drifting to the loose floorboard where his Winchester lay hidden, its presence calling to him like a siren song. The younger guard, Billy, shifted nervously on the porch. "Getting dark," he mumbled to his companion, a grizzled man called Mac. "Don't like this. Heard stories about the Shadow Rider. They say he could see in the dark like a mountain lion." "Shut your mouth," Mac growled, but his trigger finger twitched. "He ain't nothing but a rancher now. Soft." Inside, Daniel allowed himself a grim smile. Let them think him soft. He'd learned long ago that being underestimated was a weapon in itself. His thoughts drifted to Thunder Valley, to the day everything changed. He'd been tracking Hawley's gang for weeks, following their trail of robberies and murders across 3 territories. But he hadn't known about the brother, hadn't known how. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Ghostwalker entered, his movements fluid and controlled. He carried a coffee pot and 2 cups. "Hawley's orders," he said softly, setting them down. "Keep you alert. Got a long day ahead tomorrow." He poured 2 cups, took a sip from one, then handed the other to Daniel, showing it wasn't poisoned. "Why are you here, Sam?" Daniel asked quietly, using Ghostwalker's real name. "You were never one for unnecessary killing." Ghostwalker's eyes narrowed slightly. "So you do remember. Thought you might. Crossed paths with you in Wyoming 5 years back. You were riding with the Carson gang then. I'd let you go because you tried to stop them from killing that family in Sweetwater." "That was different times," Ghostwalker replied, but something flickered in his eyes. "Thing about ghosts, Cooper, or whatever your real name is, and don't just haunt the guilty." Daniel took a sip of coffee, studying the man before him. "Sarah doesn't deserve to be part of this." "No, she doesn't. But Hawley's brother didn't deserve what happened either." Ghostwalker leaned against the wall, his posture relaxed but ready. "Tell me about Thunder Valley. Your side of it. Been hearing Hawley's version for 5 years." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, the coffee growing cold in his hands. I'd been tracking them for 3 weeks. They'd hit 2 banks, killed 4 people. Didn't know the younger brother had joined them. He was using a different name. He set the cup down, the memory sharp as broken glass. It was supposed to be a clean operation. I'd set up on the ridge, had the whole valley covered. When the shooting started, the kid panicked, Ghostwalker finished. Ran straight into your line of fire. He was 17, Daniel said softly. Same age I was when I started hunting bounties. After that, the badge didn't feel right anymore. None of it did. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of pine and sage. In the stable, Sarah would be wondering about him, about the man she thought she knew. The thought cut deeper than he'd expected. Hawley's not planning to let any of us walk away from this, Daniel said finally. You know that. Ghostwalker nodded slowly. Man like that, revenge eats him up inside, changes him. He moved toward the door, then paused. She's safe for now. The schoolteacher. I made sure Chet keeps his distance. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Maybe we've all got things to make up for. After he left, Daniel sat in the growing darkness, memories washing over him like waves. He remembered his first bounty, a horse thief in Montana. Remembered the rush of the hunt, the satisfaction of bringing criminals to justice. He'd been good at it, too good perhaps. The Shadow Rider's reputation had grown with each capture, each impossible shot, each tracking feat that left other hunters shaking their heads in disbelief. A sound from outside caught his attention. Horses approaching. Through the window, he saw Tommy Parker trying to sneak closer to the cabin, using the gathering darkness as cover. The boy had learned his tracking lessons too well. "Movement!" Billy called out, raising his rifle. "By the old oak!" Daniel's heart froze. "Hold your fire!" he shouted, rising so fast his chair toppled. "It's just a kid!" Tommy broke cover, running toward the cabin. Mac grabbed him before he could reach the door, the boy struggling in his grip. "Let him go," Daniel said, his voice carrying an edge that made both guards look at him sharply. "He's nothing to do with this." "Mr. Cooper," Tommy called out, "Ma sent me to check on you. Said you hadn't sent word about Sunday dinner and—" "Shut up, kid," Mac growled, shaking him roughly. "Careful with him." Ghostwalker's quiet voice came from the shadows. He'd returned at the commotion. "Boss won't like us drawing attention." Daniel moved to the door, every step measured. "Tommy, listen to me carefully. You're going to ride home right now. Tell your ma I won't be making it to dinner. Tell her to keep everyone close to home for the next few days. Understand?" The boy's eyes were wide, darting between Daniel and his captors. "But, Mr. Cooper, I can help, like you taught me about tracking and—" "Now, Tommy!" Daniel's voice cracked, like a whip, carrying an authority that made even the guards straighten. Some lessons aren't meant to be learned, not by boys who still have a choice. Before we continue with Tommy's departure and the growing tension, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we've saved something special just for you. Mac released the boy, who stumbled toward his pony. As Tommy mounted up, he looked back at Daniel with a mixture of fear and confusion. "You're different," he said quietly. "Like they're saying in town. You're not just a rancher." "Go home, son," Daniel replied softly. "Some truths are better left in the dark." As the boy rode away, Ghostwalker stepped closer. "Kid reminds me of someone," he said meaningfully. "About the same age as—" "Don't," Daniel cut him off. The parallel wasn't lost on him. Another young boy, another chance to prevent tragedy. In the stable, Sarah would be wondering about the commotion, about the man she thought she knew. The secrets were unraveling like an old rope, strand by strand. Hawley appeared from the shadows, his scarred face ghostly in the failing light. "Touching," he sneered. The killer playing father figure. Tell me, Cooper, you teach him how to track men like you tracked my brother? Teach him how to make those impossible shots? Daniel's hand twitched, and he saw Ghostwalker tense slightly. Your brother made his choice, Daniel said quietly. Let Tommy make his own. Choices? Hawley laughed, the sound bitter as winter wind. Like the choice you're going to make at sunrise? Help us, or watch everything you built here burn? He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Or maybe you'd like to see how good a shot young Billy here is when it comes to school teachers. The threat hung in the air like gun smoke, and Daniel felt the last pieces of his peaceful life slipping away. The Winchester beneath the floorboards seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, calling him back to what he truly was. As night settled over Pine Creek Valley, the Shadow Rider's legacy stretched its dark wings, ready to embrace him once more. Night had fully claimed Pine Creek Valley when Daniel heard Sarah's muffled scream from the stable. He was moving before the sound died, only to find Billy's rifle pressed against his chest at the door. Not your concern, Hawley called from the darkness. Just making sure our insurance policy stays cooperative. Another sound cut through the night, the distinctive crack of a slap followed by Ghostwalker's quiet voice. Enough, Chet. Boss wants her unharmed. Daniel's right hand twitched, and Billy took an involuntary step back, reading something in his eyes that scared him more than Hawley's threats. The young guard's rifle trembled slightly. Told you to watch him, not fear him, Hawley growled, emerging from the shadows. He's just a man, bleeds like anyone else. Tell that to the Denton brothers, Ghostwalker's voice carried from the stable. Or what's left of them. The comment hung in the air like smoke. Daniel remembered the Denton brothers, 3 vicious killers who'd specialized in terrorizing small towns. He'd tracked them through the Bitter Creek Mountains in winter, bringing them in one piece at a time. It had been one of the Shadow Rider's most famous hunts, though the stories didn't mention the cold, the hunger, the absolute necessity of each impossible shot. Mr. Cooper? Sarah's voice trembled slightly but carried strength beneath the fear. Whatever they're saying about you, I don't believe it. You're not a killer. Hawley laughed, the sound echoing off the stable walls. Lady, you don't know him at all. Tell her, Cooper. Tell her about the Dentons, about Thunder Valley, about all the men you hunted down like animals. They were the animals, Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying in the night air. Every man I hunted had a choice. They chose to kill, to steal, to destroy lives. His eyes met Hawley's, like your brother chose. The scarred man's hand dropped to his gun, but Ghostwalker stepped between them. Boss! Sun's coming up in a few hours. Need him thinking straight for tomorrow. Hawley's face twisted, but he nodded. Get some rest, Cooper. Tomorrow you're going to show us every trail, every hiding spot. You're going to help us take that payroll or... He glanced toward the stable meaningfully. As the night deepened, Daniel sat in his cabin, listening to the sounds of the guards outside. His mind worked through scenarios, calculating odds and angles. The Winchester beneath the floorboards called to him, but using it would mean returning to what he'd been and likely signing Sarah's death warrant in the process. A soft knock at the window made him tense, but it was only Tommy Parker again, this time more carefully hidden in the shadows. The boy had doubled back, using the tracking skills Daniel had taught him. Before the guards could spot him, Daniel made a subtle hand gesture, one he'd used in his hunting days to signal danger. Tommy's eyes widened in recognition, and he melted away into the darkness. Smart kid, Ghostwalker said from the doorway, making Daniel realize he'd entered unheard. Learns quick, like someone else I used to know. You were there, Daniel said, quietly. Thunder Valley saw you watching from the tree line. Ghostwalker nodded slowly. Saw everything. The kid running out, you trying to adjust your aim, was too late. He paused, studying Daniel. Always wondered why the famous Shadow Rider would quit after one bad shot. It wasn't about the shot, Daniel replied, his voice heavy with memory. It was about the cost. Every man I brought in, dead or alive, left a trail of broken lives behind. Widows, orphans, parents burying children. After Thunder Valley, couldn't tell the difference anymore between justice and vengeance. Outside, a horse whinnied softly. In the distance, an owl called. Then another answered from a different direction. Daniel tensed, recognizing a pattern. Ghostwalker noticed, too. "Town's not as asleep as Hawley thinks," he said quietly. "Marshall's deputy's been organizing since sundown. Got men in the hills." "They'll die," Daniel stated flatly. "Deputy Wells is brave but green. Hawley's men are killers." "Like you." "Were. Like I am," Daniel corrected softly. "Some things you don't unlearn. Before we continue with the approaching confrontation, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we've saved something special just for you." The night grew deeper, but Pine Creek Valley was far from asleep. Daniel could sense movement in the hills. Deputy Wells gathering townsmen, probably planning some foolhardy rescue attempt. They were good men, but they were farmers and shopkeepers. Against Hawley's crew, they wouldn't stand a chance. Sarah's voice carried from the stable, singing softly, an old hymn that seemed to float on the night air. Daniel recognized it as her way of telling him she was all right, and something in his chest tightened. She'd seen glimpses of his true nature now, yet still chose to believe in him. "Time's running out," Ghostwalker observed. "Hawley's not the kind to keep his word, even if you help him take the payroll." "I know," Daniel replied. "Man like that. Revenge means more than money." A commotion rose from the south end of the valley, shouting, then gunshots. One of Hawley's men ran up, breathless. Riders coming. Looked like townsmen, maybe 15 of them. Hawley emerged from the shadows, his face twisted with rage. "Stupid bastards want to die? Fine. Billy, Mac, with me. Rest of you watch Cooper. He makes a move, shoot him, then shoot the woman." As Hawley and several men rode out toward the sound of gunfire, Daniel's mind raced. The townsmen were creating a diversion, but they were also riding to their deaths. He thought of Tommy's father, of Sarah's students' parents, good men about, to die because they thought they could help. Quite a thing, Ghostwalker mused, still watching him. Man spends years building a reputation as a killer, then years trying to bury it. Now you got to choose which man you really are. Daniel's hand twitched again, but this time it wasn't from nerves. It was from certainty. "Already chose," he said quietly, "the moment they brought Sarah into it." Ghostwalker nodded slowly. "Figured as much. Question is, what's the Shadow Rider going to do about it?" More gunshots echoed from the south, followed by screams. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of all his choices, past and present, pressing down on him. When he opened them again, Ghostwalker saw something there that made him step back. "Ghost," Daniel said softly, using the man's old trail name. "You still got that trick of disappearing when trouble starts?" A ghost of a smile touched the outlaw's lips. "Thing about ghosts, we show up when we're needed, fade when we're not." Daniel nodded once, understanding passing between them. "Keep her safe," he said simply. As Ghostwalker slipped away into the darkness, Daniel felt the last pieces of his peaceful life falling away. The Shadow Rider had been born in blood and darkness, and it seemed that was how he would return. But this time, it wouldn't be for justice or bounty. This time, it would be for something worth far more than gold. The gunfire in the distance had quieted to sporadic shots when Daniel heard Tommy's distinctive whistle from behind the stable. 3 short notes, just as he'd taught the boy for signaling game trails. The guards tensed, but Daniel spoke quickly to cover the sound. "More of your men getting killed by farmers," he said loudly, drawing their attention. "Hawley's pride is going to get you all buried in Pine Creek Valley." His mind flashed back to similar nights, teaching young deputies how to track outlaws through darkness, how to read the land and sky for signs others missed. "Shut your mouth," Chet snapped from his position by the door, but his eyes betrayed his nervousness. The night had grown thick with tension, and somewhere out there, townsmen were dying for trying to help. Daniel moved to the window, carefully positioning himself so the guards could see his hands. In the pale moonlight, the scars on his knuckles stood out, marks from years of teaching harder lessons to men who'd chosen the wrong path. "You know what the difference is between hunters and killers?" he asked conversationally, pitching his voice to Carrie. "Hunters understand patience. They read signs. They know when prey is panicked, running blind." Behind the stable, Tommy whistled. Again, this time the signal for message received. Daniel had taught him trail communication during their supposed hunting lessons, each whistle and bird call carefully practiced until they became second nature. The boy had soaked up knowledge like dry earth in spring rain, reminding Daniel of himself at that age, learning from old mountain men and veteran trackers. "I said, shut up!" Chet's voice cracked slightly. He was the weak link, young, nervous, prone to mistakes. Daniel had spotted it earlier, just as he'd taught others to recognize such weaknesses in their quarry. "Take Billy here," Daniel continued calmly, gesturing to the younger guard. "Holds his rifle too tight, telegraphs his moves. In a real fight, that gets you killed." He turned to the young guard. "You've got potential, kid. Better than this life. Your pa teach you to shoot." Billy shifted uncomfortably, the moonlight catching his young face. Daniel saw in him what he'd seen in countless others. A boy trying to be a man, taking the wrong path because no one showed him a better one. "How'd you know about my pa?" "Way you handle that Winchester. Military grip, Confederate cavalry. I'm guessing from the angle you hold it, he'd teach you to track too." Daniel remembered the lessons he'd learned from veteran trackers after the war, how they'd shaped him into what he'd become. The young man's eyes widened slightly. "How—" "Shut your damn mouth, Billy." Chet moved forward threateningly, but Daniel continued as if he hadn't spoken, his voice taking on the same patient tone he'd used to teach Tommy about reading weather signs and tracking deer. "You've got your pa's eyes," he said softly. "Same look he had in Chattanooga when he helped me track deserters through the mountain fog. James William Hawthorne. Never knew he had a son." The memory was clear as yesterday. James teaching him about reading moss on trees, about finding north without a compass, lessons that had later saved his life countless times. Billy's rifle lowered slightly, uncertainty clouding his features. You knew my father?" "Served with him for 6 months, Daniel replied, memories flooding back. "Good man. Taught me about reading weather signs, tracking through difficult terrain. Skills I used later when I became—" He paused, letting the weight of unspoken words fill the air. Daniel thought about all the lessons he'd passed on over the years, teaching young deputies about patience and observation, showing Tommy how to read animal signs and understand the land's language. Each lesson a way of passing on not just skills, but values, hoping to guide others away from the darker paths he'd walked. Sarah's voice carried from the stable, where she'd been listening. "Daniel, what's happening out there?" "Everything's fine. Miss Miller," he called back, his eyes never leaving Billy. "Just teaching some lessons about choices, like I taught Tommy about reading signs, tracking trails, about using skills to help people instead of harm them." He remembered Sarah watching him teach her students about nature during their school outings, how she'd smiled at his gentle patience with the children. The night air carried the scent of pine and sage, reminding Daniel of countless lessons taught under open skies. He'd shown Tommy how different plants could tell you about water sources, how certain birds would warn of approaching storms or strangers. Each lesson carefully chosen to build not just skills, but character. Chet moved forward aggressively. "Enough of this! Billy, don't listen to his—" A shot rang out from the darkness, cutting him off. Ghostwalker materialized from the shadows, his gun still smoking. "Sorry, Chet," he said softly. "Some men can't be taught." The words carried the weight of experience, of lessons learned too late. Billy's rifle swung between them, uncertain. Like so many young men Daniel had known, he stood at a crossroads between two paths. What's happening?" "What's happening," Daniel said calmly, "is you're getting a chance your pa would want you to take. Same chance I should have given. Holly's brother in Thunder Valley." He moved slowly toward the stable, every movement a lesson in controlled power. "Ghost, get Miss Miller out of here. Billy, time to choose what kind of man you want to be." The young guard's hands trembled on his rifle. "They'll kill me if I help you." "They'll try," Daniel corrected, his voice carrying the same steady patience he used when teaching Tommy to shoot. "But you've got your pa's blood, and now you've got someone to teach you properly." He gestured to the hills. "Tommy, show yourself, son." Tommy emerged from the darkness, moving with the stealth Daniel had taught him over countless dawn patrols and twilight tracking lessons. The boy's face was streaked with dirt, but his eyes shone with the pride of a student showing his master what he'd learned. "Been watching everything," Tommy said proudly. "Like you taught me, Mr. Cooper, reading signs, staying hidden, got messages to Deputy Wells about their positions." Every word reflected months of careful instruction, of lessons learned not just with the mind, but with the heart. Before we continue with this crucial moment, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Because tomorrow we've saved something special just for you. Daniel nodded approvingly, feeling the pride of a teacher seeing his student excel. "Good boy. Now you're going to help Billy here get Miss Miller to safety. Ghost, you'll cover their retreat. Use the game trail by Dead Man's Creek. Hawley's men won't know it." He'd taught Tommy about that trail last summer, showing him how the deer used it during migrations. "What about you?" Sarah asked as Ghostwalker helped her from the stable. Her face showed concern, but also something else. Understanding, perhaps, or acceptance of who he truly was. She'd seen him teaching, after all, had watched him guide, and shape young minds with the same care he used to shape their futures. "Got some teaching to do," Daniel replied grimly. "Hawley needs to learn about consequences." He turned to Billy. "Your choice, son, but make it fast." The young man stood, frozen for a moment, then slowly lowered his rifle. "My pa, he really served with you?" "Saved my life in those mountains," Daniel confirmed. "Now I'm returning the favor by saving his son from becoming something he'd hate." He remembered James Hawthorne's lessons about honor, about using skills to protect rather than destroy. As Ghostwalker led Sarah and Billy toward the creek trail, Tommy lingered, his young face torn between duty and desire. "I can help, Mr. Cooper. You taught me everything about—" "Not everything," Daniel cut him off gently. "Some lessons no boy should learn. Remember what I taught you about courage, Tommy? Sometimes it's braver to walk away." The words echoed lessons he'd learned too late in his own life. Truths bought with blood and regret. The boy's eyes filled with tears of frustration. "But you're facing them alone." Daniel smiled slightly. "No, son. Got all your pa's lessons with me. Got everything I've taught you and Billy. A man's teachings live on through those he guides right." He squeezed Tommy's shoulder, remembering all the times they'd sat by the creek, talking about more than just tracking and hunting, talking about life, about choices, about becoming the kind of man who builds rather than destroys. As the small group disappeared into the darkness, Daniel moved to his cabin. The Winchester waited beneath the floorboards, along with all the skills and instincts he'd tried to bury. But this time they'd serve a different purpose. Not for bounty or justice, but to protect those he'd taught, those who believed in him. The sound of horses approaching signaled Hawley's return. Daniel knew there would be blood on the gang, leaders' hands, blood of good men who died trying to help him. As he lifted the floorboard and felt the familiar weight of his rifle, Daniel reflected on all the lessons he'd learned and taught over the years. Some men taught destruction, like Hawley. Some taught fear. Daniel had once taught death, dealing it out with precise shots and relentless pursuit. But here in Pine Creek Valley, he'd learned to teach life instead, tracking game instead of men, reading weather instead of signs of violence, building instead of destroying. Now it was time for one final lesson. The Winchester felt alive in Daniel's hands as he emerged from the cabin into the moonlit night. Its familiar weight spoke of countless hunts, of impossible shots and relentless pursuits. But now, as he moved silently through the shadows of Pine Creek Valley, each step felt different, purposeful in a way his old hunts had never been. Hawley's voice carried from the direction of the main road. "Find them! They couldn't have gotten far." The gang leader's rage echoed across the valley, followed by the sound of horses being spurred hard. Daniel used the noise as cover, moving toward the old oak tree where he'd first taught Tommy about reading tracks. From this position, he could see 3 of Hawley's men spreading out along the creek bed, while others searched the stable area. Their movements were sloppy, desperate, nothing like the careful precision he'd once taught young deputies about. Maintaining formation during night searches. The memory of those teaching days struck him hard. He'd spent years trying to forget the skills that had made him legendary, only to find himself using them now to protect everything he'd built. Pegu, irony wasn't lost on him. "Cooper!" Hawley's voice boomed across the valley. "You think you're clever? Teaching that boy your tricks, turning my men against me." A shot rang out, striking the cabin's wall. "Come face me, or should I send my men to the schoolhouse? Lot of families in this valley don't know how to lock their doors at night." Daniel's right hand tightened on the Winchester. The old instincts surged through him. Angle calculations, wind variations, distance estimations. But mixed with them now were newer thoughts. Sarah's face when she spoke of her students, Tommy's eager eyes learning about tracking, Billy's chance at redemption. "Been watching you for weeks," Hawley continued, his voice dripping venom. "Playing. Rancher, playing teacher. Saw you with that schoolmarm, with that Parker boy. Saw you trying to wash the blood off your hands with honest work. But blood doesn't wash away, does it, Shadow Rider?" Movement in the undergrowth caught Daniel's attention. Ghost Walker materialized like his namesake, moving silently to Daniel's position. "Miss Miller and the boys are safe," he whispered. "Got them to the old mine shaft, like you said. Deputy Wells has men guarding the approach." Daniel nodded, relief, mixing with concern. Hawley's men. 3 dead in the south pasture. Farmers got lucky. Ghost Walker's voice carried a note of respect. "Rest are scattered, but they'll regroup. Hawley won't let this go." "No," Daniel agreed softly. "He won't." His mind raced through options, each one darker than the last. The Shadow Rider would have simply started shooting, picking off targets one by one. But he wasn't just the Shadow Rider anymore. A scream cut. Through the night, one of Hawley's men had found a farmer trying to flank their position. The sound of a beating followed, punctuated by Hawley's laughter. "See what happens when good folks try to help you, Cooper? More blood on your hands." Before we continue with Daniel's response to this escalation, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we've saved something special just for you. Daniel's jaw tightened. The decision he'd been wrestling with crystallized in that moment. He couldn't escape his past, but maybe he could use it, not for vengeance or justice, but for protection. To save rather than destroy. "Ghost," he said quietly, "remember that trick we used in the Bitter Creek Mountains when we cornered the Denton brothers?" Ghost Walker's eyes widened slightly. "That was different. We had a whole posse then, and they were trapped in that canyon. Principles are the same." Daniel checked his Winchester one last time. "Fear, confusion, make them think they're surrounded by more than they are. "You're really him, aren't you?" Ghostwalker asked, a note of awe in his voice. "The man they wrote about, the one who could be everywhere at once." Daniel's smile was grim in the darkness. "No, I'm something else now. Something better, I hope." He handed Ghostwalker a small tin whistle, the same kind he'd used to teach Tommy bird calls. "Remember the signals?" Another scream echoed from the valley, followed by rough laughter. Daniel's expression hardened. Time to teach Hawley why the Shadow Rider wasn't just about good shots and clever tracking. "They'll be waiting for you to use the Winchester," Ghostwalker warned. "Your reputation with that rifle." "Exactly," Daniel replied, reaching into his coat and producing an old Colt revolver, the one he'd kept hidden even longer than the rifle. Sometimes the best lessons come from surprising the student. He moved through the darkness like a ghost, himself, each step placed with the precision he'd learned from years of stalking dangerous prey. But this time, he wasn't hunting for bounty or fame. This time, he was protecting a home, a community, a future. "You think this changes anything?" Hawley's voice carried on the night wind. "You think playing teacher and rancher makes up for my brother? For all the men you hunted down?" Daniel positioned himself carefully, noting how Hawley's men had clustered together, a rookie mistake he'd taught countless deputies to avoid. They were afraid now, jumping at shadows. "Good. Your brother made his choice," Daniel called back, his voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "An old trick, using the valley's acoustics. Like you're making yours now, threatening children, hurting innocent people. That's not revenge, Hawley. That's just evil." Ghostwalker's whistle cut through the night, 3 sharp notes that mimicked a hawk's cry. Daniel smiled slightly, remembering teaching that signal to Tommy. Now it served a darker purpose, making Hawley's men turn frantically, trying to locate threats in the shadows. "Evil?" Hawley's laugh was bitter. "You're one to talk about evil, Shadow Rider. How many men did you kill? How many families did you destroy?" "Every man I hunted had a choice," Daniel replied, his voice seeming to move around the valley. "Every single one could have walked away, chosen a different path." He thought of Billy, of the choice he'd made tonight. "Like your brother could have, like you could now." Another whistle, this time from a different direction. Daniel watched Hawley's men growing more nervous, their formations breaking down. The gang leader himself stood in the open, trying to project confidence, but betraying his fear with every twitching movement. "Come out and face me!" Hawley screamed, firing his gun into the darkness. "Face me like a man!" Daniel's voice carried cold and clear across the valley. "I'm not the man you're looking for, Hawley. That man died in Thunder Valley, with your brother. I'm something else now, something you helped create tonight, when you threatened my home." The night seemed to press in around them, filled with whispers and shadows. Daniel moved silently from position to position, laying the groundwork for what was to come. Each step was measured, each movement calculated, not for death now, but for life. He thought of Sarah, of her belief in second chances, thought of Tommy learning to use skills for helping rather than hurting, thought of Billy choosing a better path. The Shadow Rider had been born in violence and darkness, but perhaps he could be reborn in protection and light. Protection. The decision was made. Daniel Cooper, rancher and teacher, would use every skill the Shadow Rider had possessed, not to end lives this time, but to save them, to protect the valley that had given him a second chance, and to ensure others would have the same opportunity. "Last chance, Hawley," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. "Ride out now, leave this valley and its people in peace, or stay and learn why the stories about the Shadow Rider weren't stories at all." The night held its breath, waiting for Hawley's choice and for the lesson that would follow. The moon cast long shadows across Pine Creek Valley as Daniel moved like a ghost through the darkness. His Winchester remained slung across his back, a deliberate choice that would have surprised anyone who knew the legends of the Shadow Rider's impossible shots. Instead, he held the old Colt, a weapon for closer work. Hawley's voice shattered the night's silence. "You're not the only one with tricks, Cooper." A burst of flame erupted from the direction of Daniel's cabin. They'd set it ablaze. "Let's see how well you move when your whole valley's lit up." Daniel watched his home burn, but his expression remained calm. Fire meant light, and light meant shadows, something he'd learned long ago in his hunting days. He caught Ghostwalker's eye from across the clearing and nodded once. The first whistle cut through the darkness, a perfect imitation of a barn owl, then another from a different direction, followed by a third. Daniel's lessons to Tommy about bird calls were serving a darker purpose tonight. "They're surrounding us," one of Hawley's men shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "It's just tricks," Hawley snarled, but Daniel could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "The famous Shadow Rider, playing games in the dark." "Not games," Daniel called out, his voice seeming to come from everywhere at once. Another old trick he'd perfected years ago. "Lessons, like the one your brother never learned in Thunder Valley." A shot rang out, wild and desperate, from one of Hawley's men. Daniel had been counting their shots, tracking their positions by the muzzle flashes. 7 men left, spread out in a ragged circle. Afraid. "You remember Thunder Valley, Hawley?" Daniel's voice moved through the darkness. "Your brother wasn't supposed to be there. None of those people were supposed to die, but you pushed him into it, didn't you? Just like you're pushing these men now." "Shut up!" Hawley fired into the darkness, his shot going wide. "You don't know anything." "I know everything," Daniel replied, and now his voice carried the weight of all his years of tracking, all his years of reading signs others missed. "I know how you forced him to join your gang. Know how you convinced him that violence was the only way, just like you're doing with these men now." Another whistle pierced the night, followed by a sudden commotion as one of Hawley's men went. "Down, Ghostwalker's handiwork, 6 left. Boss!" The cry came from near the burning cabin. "Someone's out there." "I can't," the voice cut off abruptly. 5. Before we continue with this intense confrontation, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we've saved something special just for you. Daniel moved through the shadows like water, each step placed with deadly precision. The fire from his cabin had created a maze of light and darkness, and he used it like he'd once used the terrain of mountain passes and desert canyons. "You're still the same killer," Hawley shouted, but his voice betrayed his growing fear. "Think playing rancher changes anything? Think teaching that boy makes up for all the men you hunted down?" "Every man I hunted had a choice," Daniel replied, sliding closer. "Like the choice I'm giving your men now." His voice carried across the valley. "Walk away. Live to see morning. Stay and learn why they called me Shadow Rider." 2 more of Hawley's men broke and ran, disappearing into the darkness. Daniel let them go. They were young, scared, not killers at heart. Like Billy, they'd chosen a better path when offered. 3 left. Ghostwalker's whistle signaled from a new position. Daniel moved accordingly, the 2 of them working together like they had years ago in the Bitter Creek Mountains. But this time, they weren't hunting outlaws for bounty. This time, they were protecting something worth more than gold. "Your brother was 17, Daniel said, his voice carrying clearly through the night. "Same age I was when I started hunting bounties. Same age as some of these men you're getting killed. Does that help you sleep at night, Hawley?" A shot rang out. Closer this time, but still wild. Daniel counted 2 rounds left in that gun. Details mattered in the dark. "You're the one who killed him." Hawley's voice cracked with rage and grief. "You're the one who took the shot." "Because you gave him no choice," Daniel replied softly, now close enough to see Hawley's face in the firelight. "Like you're giving these men no choice now." Another whistle, another sudden struggle in the darkness. One of Hawley's remaining men cried out, then fell silent. Two left, Hawley and his last loyal gun. The fire from Daniel's cabin had begun to die down, but it had served its purpose. The valley was a maze of shadows and light, and in those shadows, the legend of the Shadow Rider lived again. Not for vengeance now, but for protection. "Show yourself," Hawley screamed, firing his last round into the darkness. "Face me like a man." "A man," Daniel said, his voice carrying quiet authority, "doesn't threaten school teachers, doesn't burn homes, doesn't force boys to become killers." He stepped into a patch of moonlight. The old Colt held steady at his side. "A man protects, teaches, builds things instead of destroying them." Hawley spun to face him, his empty gun clicking uselessly. His last remaining man raised his rifle, but Ghostwalker's whistle froze him in place. The barrel of a gun pressed against the back of his head. "It's over, Hawley," Daniel said quietly. "Your men are gone. The valley's protected. Time to end this." "Nothing's over." Hawley drew a knife, its blade gleaming in the dying firelight. "You took everything from me. My brother, my reputation. Everything." "You did that yourself," Daniel replied, his voice heavy with truth. "Every choice, every step that led here, they were all yours, just like Thunder Valley." Hawley charged with a roar of grief and rage, the knife slashing through the air where Daniel had been standing. But the Shadow Rider hadn't earned his reputation just with a rifle. He moved like his namesake, seeming to fade into darkness and reappear elsewhere. The fight was brief, brutal, and ultimately merciful. Daniel could have killed him. The old instincts, the muscle memory, all screamed for it. But the man he'd become, the teacher, the protector, chose differently. Hawley lay in the dirt, disarmed and defeated, as the first light of dawn began to touch Pine Creek Valley. His last, loyal man had surrendered to Ghostwalker without a fight. "Kill me," Hawley spat, blood running from his split lip. "Finish what you started in Thunder Valley." Daniel looked down at him, the old Colt still steady in his hand. "Your brother died because of choices, his and yours. I carry that weight every day, but I chose to do something with it, to teach instead of destroy, to protect instead of hunt." He paused, seeing Sarah and Tommy approaching with Deputy Wells and his men. "That's the difference between us, Hawley. I learned from my ghosts. You let yours consume you." As the law took custody of Hawley and his remaining man, Daniel felt the weight of the past lifting. The Shadow Rider would always be part of him, but now those skills served a different purpose. The Winchester on his back, the Colt in his hand. They were tools for protection now, not destruction. Sarah reached him first, her eyes taking in the scene, the smoldering cabin, the signs of struggle, the man who stood revealed in the growing dawn. "You could have killed them all," she said softly. "The stories about the Shadow Rider." "Stories are just stories," Daniel replied, holstering the Colt. "Truth is in the choices we make, the lives we touch. Everything else is just shadow and smoke." Tommy rushed up, his young face glowing with excitement and relief. "Mr. Cooper, you were amazing. The way you used the bird calls, just like you taught me, and how you moved in the dark." "Those were lessons for life, Tommy," Daniel cut him off gently. "Not for fighting. Remember that." As the sun rose over Pine Creek Valley, Daniel Cooper, rancher, teacher, and yes, the Shadow Rider, looked at the life he'd chosen to protect. His cabin could be rebuilt, his reputation would always be complex. But here in this valley, with these people, he'd found something worth more than any bounty, a chance to use his skills for life rather than death, for protection rather than destruction. The legend of the Shadow Rider would live on, but transformed, like the man himself, into something that built rather than broke, that taught rather than hunted, that protected rather than pursued. The morning sun climbed over Pine Creek Valley, illuminating the aftermath of the night's events. Daniel stood amid the smouldering remains of his cabin, Sarah and Tommy beside him, while Deputy Wells and his men led Hawley and his surviving follower toward town. Ghost Walker had vanished with the dawn, leaving only footprints in the morning dew as evidence he'd ever been there. "Never figured the Shadow Rider for a teacher," Deputy Wells said, approaching Daniel with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. "Stories about you, they were legend when I was training for my badge." Daniel ran his hand along the Winchester's worn stock, feeling every nick and scratch that told the story of his past. "Stories grow tall with time, Deputy. Truth's usually simpler." "Simple?" Sarah's voice carried a hint of disbelief. "What I saw last night wasn't simple. The way you moved, the things you did." She paused, studying his face in the morning light. "Yet you chose not to kill them. The Shadow Rider I heard stories about wouldn't have shown such mercy." "Maybe that's because he's not just the Shadow Rider anymore," Tommy piped up, his young face earnest. "He's Mr. Cooper, too, the man who taught me about tracking deer, not people. About using skills to help, not hurt." Daniel felt something warm in his chest at the boy's words, the simple wisdom of youth, cutting straight to truths adults often overlooked. "Tommy's right," he said softly. "We're all more than our past actions. It's the choices we make today that define us." Billy approached tentatively, his father's military bearing visible in his straight spine despite his obvious nervousness. "Mr. Cooper, sir, I wanted to thank you for what you said about my pa and for giving me a chance." "Your pa gave me chances when I was learning," Daniel replied, meeting the young man's eyes. "Sometimes that's all anyone needs, a chance to choose differently." He glanced at the ruins of his cabin. "Speaking of choices, got a lot of rebuilding to do." "We'll help," Tommy exclaimed. "Won't we, Billy? Mr. Cooper taught me all about building proper fence posts and strong foundations. Bet he knows about cabins, too." Billy nodded eagerly, and Daniel saw in both young men's faces something he'd spent years trying to bury. Hope. The same hope he'd once seen in young deputies he'd trained, in farmers he'd helped protect, in people who believed in justice rather than vengeance. Sarah moved closer, her hand finding his. "The whole town will help. You protected us, Daniel, protected our children, our homes." She gestured to where several townspeople were already gathering, carrying tools and supplies. "This valley's not just your hiding place anymore. It's your home." Before we continue with this moment of community unity, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we've saved something special just for you. The morning breeze carried the scent of pine and sage, mixed now with wood smoke from the burned cabin. Daniel watched as more townspeople arrived, their faces showing not fear of the revealed Shadow Rider, but gratitude to the man who'd protected their valley. Mrs. Parker, Tommy's mother, brought food for the workers. "Least we can do," she said, firmly, setting down baskets of bread and dried meat. "After what you did for Tommy, teaching him good skills, keeping him safe last night." "He's a natural tracker," Daniel replied, watching the boy show Billy how to read the signs of last night's confrontation in the disturbed earth. "Just needed guidance toward the right path." The town banker, Mr. Harrison, arrived with his wagon, loaded with lumber. "Had this saved for repairs," he announced. "Reckon it's better used here. Man who keeps our payroll safe deserves a proper roof over his head." Daniel felt Sarah squeeze his hand. "See?" she whispered. "They don't see a legend or a killer. They see you, the man who chose to protect rather than destroy." Throughout the morning, more people arrived, farmers with tools and strong backs, women with food and water for the workers, children eager to help, watching wide-eyed as Daniel showed them how to sort useful materials from the rubble, teaching even in the midst of rebuilding. "Mr. Cooper," Tommy called out, pride evident in his voice as he pointed to marks in the dirt. "Look, I can read everything that happened last night. See how you moved here and here? He traced patterns only a trained eye could follow. You were protecting us even before the fighting started, weren't you? Placing yourself between Hawley's men and the town. Daniel knelt beside the boy, aware of others gathering to listen. Reading signs isn't just about tracking, Tommy. It's about understanding, about seeing the whole story, not just the parts that stand out. He pointed to different marks. See here, these show choices. Hawley's men choosing to run rather than fight. Ghostwalker choosing to help rather than hurt. Every mark tells part of the story. Like the stories about you? A young girl asked, one of Sarah's students. Are they all true? Daniel stood, feeling the weight of many eyes upon him. Stories are complicated things, he said carefully. Sometimes they tell us more about what people want to believe than what really happened. The Shadow Rider, he was real, did things that needed doing, hunting men who'd chosen to hurt others. But that's not all of who I am. You're our teacher, Tommy stated firmly, our protector. That's better than any legend. Sarah beamed at the boy's words, and Daniel saw heads nodding throughout the gathered crowd. The transformation was complete. Not just his own, from hunter to protector, but the community's perception of him as well. Well, announced Mr. Harrison, clapping his hands together, legends don't build cabins. Let's get to work, folks. Show the Shadow Rider how Pine Creek Valley takes care of its own. As the community mobilized around him, Daniel felt the last weights of his past lifting. The Winchester on his back, the Colt at his hip, they were no longer symbols of death and pursuit, but tools of protection. Like the skills he'd taught Tommy, like the lessons he shared with Sarah's students, they had been transformed by choice and purpose. Billy approached with a load of lumber, his bearing more confident now. Sir, while we work, would you tell us about my pa, about what he taught you? Daniel smiled, seeing the same eagerness to learn in Billy's eyes that he saw in Tommy's. Better than that, he replied. I'll show you what he showed me. About reading weather in the clouds, about finding true north without a compass, about using skills to build something worthwhile. As the sun climbed higher over Pine Creek Valley, Daniel Cooper, teacher, protector, and yes, the Shadow Rider, watched his community come together to rebuild not just his home, but his place in their lives. The legend had become something new, something better, not a tale of hunting and death, but a story of protection and growth. Every swing of a hammer, every shared meal, every lesson taught to eager young minds was another step away from the shadow of his past and into the light of his chosen future. The Shadow Rider would always be part of him, but now those skills served life rather than death, community rather than solitude, protection rather than pursuit. And in the end, that transformation was the greatest legend of all. 1 year had passed since the night Pine Creek Valley learned the truth about Daniel Cooper. His rebuilt cabin stood as a testament to community spirit, larger than before, with a covered porch where he now sat teaching tracking skills to a group of eager students. Tommy Parker, his star pupil, helped demonstrate techniques to the newer learners, his confidence growing with each lesson. The cabin's expansion wasn't just about living space. The townspeople had insisted on adding a proper schoolroom to one side, where Sarah, now Sarah Cooper, could teach during winter months when the weather made the trek to town difficult for outlying farm children. The other side had become a workshop where Daniel trained selected young men in the finer points of protection and peacekeeping. Remember, Daniel was saying to his gathered students, tracking isn't about hunting people. It's about understanding signs, reading the land, knowing when someone might need help. His right hand rested casually on his Winchester, but these days it was more teaching prop than weapon. Billy Hawthorne, who'd stayed in the valley after that fateful night, stood at the edge of the group. Now, Deputy Hawthorne, he carried himself, with the quiet confidence his father would have been proud to see. "Tell them about the Anderson rescue, Mr. Cooper," he suggested. "About how reading signs saved those children." Daniel nodded, remembering the incident from 2 months ago. 3 children, lost in the high country during an early snow. Their tracks told a story, not just where they'd gone, but how tired they were, how scared. Reading those signs helped us find them before the storm hit. "Like you found me," piped up Jenny Martinez, one of his younger students, "when I got lost picking berries." "That was different," Tommy said with authority. "You left clear signs because Mr. Cooper taught your class about marking trails." These children didn't know how. Sarah appeared in the cabin doorway, watching the lesson with pride. Her hand rested on her growing belly. Their first child was due in spring. The sight reminded Daniel how much his life had changed, how far. He'd come from the solitary hunter he'd once been. "The shadow rider saved people too," one of the boys said. "My pa told me stories about how he brought justice to bad men." Daniel exchanged a glance with Sarah before responding. "The shadow rider did what he thought was right at the time, but there are better ways to help people than hunting them, better ways to bring justice than with a gun." Before we continue, with this reflection on justice and change, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we've saved something special just for you. Ghost Walker's occasional visits had become something of an event in the valley. He never stayed long, but each time he brought news of other reformed outlaws, men who'd heard about Pine Creek Valley and its unusual protector, seeking their own chance at redemption. "Building something that lasts," Ghost Walker had said during his last visit, watching Daniel work with his students. "That's harder than any hunt we ever did." The valley itself had changed too. Word had spread about a place where second chances were possible, where skills could be turned toward protection rather than destruction. The town had grown, but carefully, selectively. Daniel and Deputy Wells screened newcomers, ensuring they sought honest work rather than easy prey. "Mr. Cooper," Tommy called out, pointing to fresh tracks near the tree line. "Riders coming, 3 of them moving slow." Daniel smiled at the boy's keen observation. "Good eye. And what else do the signs tell you?" Tommy studied the approach carefully. "1 horse is carrying double weight, maybe injured rider. They're being careful with their mounts, not pushing hard. And—" he hesitated, then grinned. "They're following the safe trail markers we set up last month." "Which means," Daniel prompted. "They're honest folks," Billy answered. "Troublemakers don't usually follow marked trails." The riders emerged from the trees, a family group, travel-worn but hopeful. Daniel recognized the look in the father's eyes, a man seeking a fresh start, just as he had once done. "Welcome to Pine Creek Valley," he called out, rising from his chair. "I'm Daniel Cooper. Looks like your horse could use some rest." The man dismounted carefully, helping his wife down. Their young daughter clung to the 3rd horse, eyes wide as she took in the gathered students. "Name's Michael Reeves. Heard tell of this place. Heard it was where a man could make an honest, fresh start." Sarah stepped forward, her natural warmth putting the newcomers at ease. "You heard right, Mr. Reeves, though we expect honest work and respect for our ways." "That's all we're asking for, ma'am," Reeves replied. "Been running from what I used to be. Heard stories about this valley, about the man who protects it, about second chances." Daniel studied the family carefully, reading signs subtler than tracks. The man's calloused hands spoke of hard work. The way he positioned himself spoke of military training, but the gentleness with his family showed a man choosing a better path. "Second chances are earned here," Daniel said finally. "Through honest work and helping others. The past matters less than the choices you make now." Tommy had already approached the daughter, his natural friendliness drawing a shy smile from her. "Want to see our schoolroom?" he asked. "Miss Sarah, Mrs. Cooper now. She teaches us reading and numbers, and Mr. Cooper teaches us about the land and tracking and helping people. As the children chatted, Daniel led the Reeves to his workshop. Valley needs good people, he explained. Folks willing to learn, to help protect what we've built here. Your background, whatever it is, could be useful if you choose to. Use it right. Used to be cavalry, Reeves admitted. Then other things, but that's not what I want for my daughter. Understanding comes before judgment here, Sarah said softly. My husband taught us that. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley as Daniel's students demonstrated their skills for the newcomers. Each tracking lesson, each demonstration of reading signs, carried the deeper message that had become Pine Creek Valley's foundation. Skills were neutral. It was how you used them that mattered. Later, as the sun set and the Reeves family settled into the town's boarding house, Daniel stood on his porch with Sarah. The evening air carried the scent of pine and sage, mixed with wood smoke from cooking fires. Another family seeking a fresh start, Sarah mused, leaning against him. Remember when you were doing the same? Daniel smiled, his hand covering hers where it rested on her belly. Difference is, I thought I had to bury who I was. Took Hawley's gang to teach me that changing isn't about hiding your past. It's about using it differently. The Winchester hung over the workshop door now, more symbol than weapon. But its presence reminded everyone that protection sometimes required strength, and that strength was best guided by wisdom. The baby kicked, Sarah said suddenly, grinning. Another student for you to teach. Another chance to pass on the right lessons, Daniel agreed. About tracking life instead of death. About using skills to protect and build. As darkness settled over Pine Creek Valley, Daniel Cooper, teacher, protector, husband, and mentor, reflected on the legacy he was building. The Shadow Rider's skills hadn't died. They'd been transformed like iron in a forge into something stronger and more valuable. The legend lived on, but it had changed. Now it was a story of redemption, of protection, of building something that would last beyond any one man's lifetime. In every student he taught, every family he helped, every life he touched, the legacy grew stronger. And in the end, that was worth more than all the bounties he'd ever collected. The valley had become more than a hiding place. It was a beacon for those seeking their own transformation. Each person who found their way here, who chose to learn and grow and protect, added another chapter to the story. The Shadow Rider's greatest hunt had led him not to a fugitive, but to himself. And in finding his true purpose, he'd helped others. Find theirs as well. That Daniel knew was a legacy worth protecting.